qué contentos hemos llegado a estos tiempos que ahora se ven. Nosotros hemos los
The Mexican Revolution was the first truly social revolution in the world in the 20th century. Now, the Mexican Revolution did not begin as a social revolution, much like the wars for independence in Latin America did not really begin as independence movements. The social revolution is ultimately something that the Mexican Revolution evolved into, and it sought to address many of the shortcomings of the Porfiriato, which had benefited the wealthy, the oligarchy, the científicos, the scientific advisors who met with Porfirio Diaz and advised him to follow a positivist agenda of progress in Mexico. And we can think of the sort of social compression that happened in the late 19th century in Mexico, the loss of working lands, the loss of lands by peasants, the repression of the working class. All of these things exploded into a major revolution that begins in 1910. But it's important to note that the Mexican Revolution actually started as a political revolution, like the one that you read about in Argentina. It was primarily the discontented middle class who wanted political reform in Mexico and to end dictatorship so that they could find their own way and their own access into power. But ultimately, once the revolution begins as political revolution meant to bring middle-class Mexicans into political power, it expands into the countryside, where it creates a whole new set of issues across Mexico and, indeed, throughout the rest of Latin America over the course of the 20th century. So, to trace the causes of the Mexican Revolution, it would do us well to go back a bit to our lessons about order and progress across Latin America, and the social cost that came alongside this. Economic progress, economic development in Latin America was decidedly lopsided. It benefited the wealthy, especially large landowners who saw their land values skyrocket during the late 19th century. And it also benefited a small oligarchic political elite. The peasants, Native Americans, the working class were decidedly left out of this great barbecue, as one historian referred to in the late 19th century. Ultimately, of course, the peasants would come to resent this. But in the late 19th century, we see many examples of Latin American states using their newly empowered technological ability to repress rebellions all across the countryside, to repress, for instance, in Brazil, the coffee growers who ran the government outside of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. They used the newly expanded power of the Brazilian state and its newly buffed military to quash the Canudos rebellion in the northern part of Brazil, where a prophet/priest named Anthony the Counselor had gathered together 30,000 discontented peasants to live in a nearly deserted northeastern Brazilian town. The Brazilian military, sent out by the newly empowered state government in Brazil, bringing order and progress in their wake, made very quick work out of this rebellion in Canudos, ultimately destroying the church that the rebels had built and the entire town of Canudos, where up to 30,000 dispossessed northern Brazilians from many different racial and class backgrounds had made their home. They were crushed by the guns of the government. A similar thing happened in Mexico, in the town of Tomochi. This was in the northern part of Mexico. What happened there was that peasants who resented the local landlords, and especially the Terrazas were a landowning group in northern Mexico in the state of Chihuahua, who owned the vast majority of the lands in that state. And during the Porfiriato, during the years of the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship, by allying themselves with the dictator Porfirio Diaz, they had expanded their land holdings even more. Ultimately, the villagers of a small town in the north called Tomochic, they rebelled. They took up their guns against the power of the government to assert their rights. They were a people who had long ago fought the Apaches to win their lands, and now that they saw their lands being threatened by nearby landholders, they used their guns to fight the government. They also thought that they were inspired by God to take up the arms of the government. There was a young girl in the state near the town of Tomochic who proposed to be, who was followed as something of a prophet. And as these peasants went to fight the guns of the government and ultimately went down in death and defeat, they were inspired by the messianic message of this young saint. So you can see that religion and peasant discontent was rampant across the countryside in Latin America in the late 19th century. Of course, it wasn't just peasants who were being dispossessed by these large governments. We saw that in Argentina, Julio Roque used the newly buffed power of the Argentine state and military to crush Indian resistance across southern Argentina and attach those lands to the growing country of Argentina, dispossessing the Indians there. Chile followed a similar course, dispossessing the Mapuche from Chile and expanding their territory into land that used to be claimed by the Mapuches. They built railroads, they divided the lands up into counties and into states, and ultimately the Mapuche found themselves dispossessed. This was another way that the Chileans expanded the power of the national government, both against their neighbors, as we saw in the War of the Pacific when the Chileans captured the nitrate-rich lands of Tarapacá and of Antofagasta, pardon me. But these were the Chilean lands which had formerly belonged to to Bolivia and to Peru, which Chile conquered. Now they turned the attention of their newly empowered state against the Mapuche Indians and conquered southern Chile. So Chile expanded its power to the north and to the south at the expense of their neighbors and at the expense of autonomous Native Americans who had long lived on lands in southern Chile, relatively independent. Now their lands, too, would be added to the Chilean state. Of course, Mexico was also expanding its lands at the expense of independent Indians. The most devastated of these groups were the Yaquis. The Yaqui Indians of northern Mexico had long lived an independent, semi-nomadic existence. When the Mexican state desired to expand its power and to economically develop the homelands of the Yaqui Indians in northern Sonora, the Yaqui Indians were faced with the full power and brunt of the newly empowered Mexican state, which used its guns against the Yaquis, captured them, and in many cases enslaved them and sent them to the Yucatan to work on the most brutal of conditions in the henequen plantations. In any case, despite the fact that Native Americans, peasants, and others suffered even as the very wealthy in Mexico expanded their power, expanded their wealth, there was nevertheless broad support amongst the upper class and some members of the middle class for Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship. Why? Because his dictatorship had ended the period of social crisis and conflict and civil war that had haunted Mexico during the age of caudillos. Some historians refer to the period where Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship stabilized Mexico as, quote, Pax Porfiriana, or the Porfirian peace. Did he bring peace? Yes, but at tremendous social cost. Nevertheless, he was good at maintaining his power. He was able to play the elites off one another by promising them if they worked alongside him, they would be rewarded, they would get the pan or bread. But if they went against him, they would get the palo, or the stick. So most of the elites in Mexico, the large landholders, most of whom really were prospering during this time, went ahead, played alongside Porfirio Diaz, supported his dictatorship, joined the oligarchy, and ruled Mexico alongside him as a part of a very small, powerful, landholding elite. This was the basis of power in Porfirio Diaz's coalition. However, by the end of the 19th century, it was becoming clear that some of Porfirio Diaz's base of power was eroding. Why was this? Well, Mexico was an overwhelmingly rural country. Nevertheless, Mexico City and the northern state of Monterrey were starting to develop some industry. These industries were worked by working-class people, unskilled laborers, who found themselves increasingly discontented with the desperate conditions in Mexican factories. Alongside the growth of industrialization, cities, and factories, we also see the growth of a middle class of managers who would oversee the operations of those factories, work for the governments, and oversee broad, far-flung distribution networks created by the export boom in Mexico. As a result, the middle class grew. Was it large? Not particularly, but it was significant. And middle-class people, these managers in Mexico, white-collar workers, they too hoped to one day achieve political power, but that was impossible under the dictatorship. An oligarchy ruled Mexico, and there were absolutely no inroads to power for this newly emergent middle class in Mexico. So that's one of the cracks that we start to see. In addition, Porfirio Diaz, over the course of 30 years, was having more and more difficulty holding his coalition together, and sometimes he had to make hard choices. As a result, some of his former allies started to resent him. This was especially the case in the north, in Nuevo León, where a man named Bernardo Reyes had expected to be appointed as Porfirio Diaz's successor when he eventually left the presidency, if in fact he ever would. Instead, was passed over for Ramón Corral, and people in the state of Nuevo León were very upset. Having been denied this opportunity, he was discontented, and so were his friends. So we see at least one caudillo in the north of Mexico very much disappointed and ready to rebel. But the truth of the matter is that ultimately Porfirio Diaz did not intend to step down. He made some inroads, talked about it. In fact, in the James Creelman interview, Porfirio Diaz had said in 1910 that he was ready to hand over the presidency of Mexico to somebody else. He said Mexico has at last become democratic. That at last the people of Mexico have advanced out of their degraded condition, that we can trust them with power and that they can vote. Now, was Porfirio Diaz sincere when he said that he was willing to give up his presidency and to allow a free national election to take place where the people would decide his successor? No, probably not. Probably not in the least. And in fact, the Creelman interview where Porfirio Diaz signaled that he was about to retire from the presidency, maybe he only said that to see who would challenge him. Maybe he wanted to see who was discontent with his rule, said that they would challenge him. So that's one of the reasons that he might have actually given this interview to Creelman. But nevertheless, Porfirio Diaz was starting to have problems holding the country together towards the end. I already mentioned the problem of the working class, the problem of the middle class had no way into power so long as this powerful, wealthy, elite oligarchy ruled the country. Also, the Americans were starting to get upset. Right? Now, Mexican railroads were built with American investment, but Porfirio Diaz, fearful that Mexico would become too reliant upon American capital, started to try and mitigate some of that dependence by asking for loans not from America, but from other countries as well. As a result, building Mexican railroads and investing in the Mexican economy became an area of competition between the United States and the British. Now, why did Porfirio Diaz do this? Because he wanted to see the United States and their investment in Mexico balanced by another power as well. But it had a contradictory result. In fact, the United States, which had always supported Porfirio Diaz up to this point, remember, the United States, their primary interest was in maintaining stability in Latin America to protect American investments in Latin America. When they saw that Porfirio Diaz was starting to favor British companies over American companies in building the railroads, they got upset. So some U.S. corporations were starting to officially resent Porfirio Diaz. Interestingly, most Mexicans didn't really realize that Porfirio Diaz was doing this, and the thing that they accused Porfirio Diaz was of selling his country out to the Americans. There was some truth in this accusation, and probably Porfirio Diaz's increasing awareness that there was resentment, that he was favoring U.S. corporations and allowing them to buy large chunks of Mexico is what ultimately resulted in Mexicans resenting him for this, but also maybe of Porfirio Diaz trying to get the British to invest as well. In any case, by 1910, there was increased resentment of Porfirio Diaz. Added to that, an economic crisis which begins in 1907 and 1910. The cyclical downturn started in the United States, but then, of course, it spread to Mexico. Many Mexicans who were expatriated in the United States, working in the United States, returned to Mexico, creating a real problem of joblessness and unemployment there. Further, people who were already in Mexico also found themselves thrown out of work. People in the mining companies became particularly upset. In Cananea, in the north of Sonora, a mining company located in Mexico but run by Americans, Mexicans during this recession had their wages cut. In fact, they'd already been paid less than Americans who worked in the company, but now they would be paid even less. In the Rio Blanco textile mills in Veracruz, this economic crunch resulted in layoffs and reduced payment, and they went on a massive strike. We can see here then that the working class was very dispossessed and upset, and the economic recession, which begins in 1907, made them even more upset and willing to strike, work off the job, and even rebel. So we see then that this is happening in the factories. It's also happening up in the north, right? Now, the north of Mexico is an area mostly made up of ranches, sprawling haciendas, and while there were peons in the north, there were a lot more independent workers. In fact, there were a lot of cowboys up in the north, and they were paid fairly well to work on the large haciendas owned by the elite in the north of Mexico. Unfortunately, the economic downturn affected them as well, and a lot of these cowboys, vaqueros as they're called in Mexico, who had overseen the estates, suddenly find themselves thrown out of work. These were guys who rode around the Mexican countryside on horseback all day with guns. When the revolution breaks out, all of these cowboys who'd been thrown out of work in the north of Mexico are ready to fight.
México, febrero 20.